Speaker introduction, Quinn Dolan.
I promised Dr. Heller that I would not waste any time with his introduction. I'm sure that a lot of people think, wow, this is such a topic for the time we're going through right now. I just want to say I booked this in April of this year, so there's probably never not a time when the Holocaust and anti-Semitism is worth talking about. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Tom Heller.
Thank you all very much. You know, I've not given this talk at a lunch before, and it's a difficult topic, and so it's interesting that you stop your meal at least temporarily and listen to me. Listening to the Star-Spangled Banner and that line, "A perilous night," I feel we are in a perilous night. And just as Francis Scott Key saw a light at the end of the darkness, and the prevailing of democracy and the prevailing of our country, this is a time when we need to fight hate, because it's very obvious, and that is the purpose of the legacy speakers of the Holocaust Center for Humanity. By telling stories of those who lived through the Holocaust, it brings it home, and I hope my own father's story will shed some light on what hate can do at a personal level. I am a speaker. I am a legacy speaker for the Holocaust Center. It used to be that the Holocaust Center sent survivors of the Holocaust to schools and to organizations like Rotary. And I know that at some point in the past, Pete Metzelaar, who is one of the only surviving Holocaust survivors still alive, spoke to you, which he's a very moving and wonderful speaker. But I will be telling the story of my own father, Paul Heller, who was born in 1914. He lived to be 87 years old, died in 2001. He was born just as World War I was underway, and he died just after 9/11 in 2001. The picture to the right is me and him on a visit that he made to Seattle. He was at that time exactly my age now, and I in schools I talk about that because I'm not going to be around all that much longer, and increasingly there won't be firsthand accounts of the experience of Nazi anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, and there will still be voices of those who said it never happened, of Holocaust deniers, and of anti-Semitism. And while anti-Semitism is really visible right now, it was also visible this past April. I gave a talk in April at the at Seattle Community College, and the week before, just a few blocks away at Temple de Hirsch Sinai, there was spray painting of anti-Semitic, very hostile graffiti on the synagogue. So it's raising its ugly head, and we have to combat it. So in this talk, I will be sharing my father's story. I had a lot of help in putting this talk together from the Holocaust Center. There will be documents that they found, and plus my father gave testimony to Steven Spielberg had made an effort called the Shoah Project to obtain the oral histories of as many survivors as he could. My father contributed to that, as did about 55,000 other survivors, and there'll be snippets of his interview. Hopefully the sound will be good. We tested it and we're not quite sure it'll show up, but there is closed captions as well. My father had no particular physical attributes that enabled him to survive 6 years in concentration camp, or almost 6 years in concentration camp. He was lucky. There were particular events that occurred that where he was just plain lucky, and because of his luck, I had the good fortune to be able to be born, and I feel a responsibility to tell this story because there were so many other children of Holocaust victims who never had the chance to be born, and who never had the chance to tell their parents' story. So my father was born in Czechoslovakia. I don't know if you can see this, in a small town called named Komatau, about 65 miles from the capital, Prague. These were, on the right, these are his parents, my grandparents, whom I never got a chance to meet. My grandfather, Alfred, was the town doctor, and his office was in the house in the middle of that row of houses. His office was on the ground floor. The family lived on the second and third floor. Elsa, his wife, I also did not get to meet. She died in the Holocaust. I took that picture on the left in 1970 from down the street. I was reluctant to take it in front of the house for fear I would meet the owner. That was my family's house, and that we were never compensated for it, so I thought it would be a very awkward moment to actually meet the current occupants, but that was my father's home. This was my father. There's the arrow. That's him in kindergarten or first grade. He was the only Jew in his class. He described not being aware of anti-Semitism at the time. This part of Czechoslovakia is the Sudetenland, and was, you'll hear more about it in a minute. You probably know this was Hitler negotiated for control of this area of Czechoslovakia in 1938, but that's getting ahead of myself. So this was him. He stayed in Komatov till he was 18, had his entire high school education there, the gymnasium there, and then decided to pursue medicine as his father, in his father's footsteps, and went to Prague, to the Charles University in Prague for medical school. So he went to Prague, and there he met Lisa Florsheim, who was from Germany, and but Hitler had just come to power in 1933, and one of the first things he had done was forbade Jews to attend German universities. And so she had to go elsewhere, and she ended up in Prague. The Charles University Medical School was taught in German, so she could study there. And my father had a crush on her for much of 5 years, but for one reason and another didn't act on it until 1938, when she was sensing the dangers that were just at the doorstep of Czechoslovakia, and she and most of my father's other friends found a way to get out of the country. And she was able to get out in early 1938 and get to the United States. But before she left, they had my father asked her out, and they had a good conversation, and there was sort of a promissory note, and she said she would do everything she could to help him get to the United States. That's where it was left. So she feared, her fears were justified. In March in September of 1938, Hitler negotiated with Chamberlain and with the French and the Italians, and there was the Munich Accord, which enabled Hitler to basically walk into Czechoslovakia, into the Sudetenland, and in March of 1939, he marched right into Prague. And I'm going to let my father tell you what happened. Hopefully we hear him. If it'll be, there'll be the, let's see if it works. Yeah, great.
Because I was as a student in Prague, I was in a German student anti-Nazi movement, and the Nazis had registered every name, and soon after the Germans moved into Prague, they arrested me. I wasn't terribly active. I just went to meetings and wore a badge to show that I was an anti-Nazi, which was enough to insult some of the students which had become already mainly Nazis.
So he was arrested, and he was released after a few days, but he was told, "You're a marked man. You had best try to leave the country." And that was in March of '39. And it takes time. There were a lot of people trying to leave. It takes time to get papers, to get a visa, to go somewhere. He intended to go to England. In fact, by August, he had gotten all those papers, and he had plans, which he'll explain now.
I had my plane reservations for early September from Prague to London. But on the 1st of September, war broke out, and the Gestapo arrested everybody who was known to them, of whom they had a record. And so early in the morning, on the 1st of September, they rang the bell in my home. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. And the Gestapo was there, but when they took me in and we arrived at the prison, there was already the news that Hitler had started the war again. That was the last time I saw him.
And so I was in Prague this summer, and I found, with my sister, I found the building where he was imprisoned in Prague for a week before he was sent to a camp. There is a plaque on the corner showing that this building had been used as a prison from 1939 to 45, and it was a somewhat gripping moment to actually have seen where this all started. So initially, he spent a week in that jail, and then was shipped to Dachau for reasons only the Nazis know, because 2 weeks later he was sent to Buchenwald, which is where he would spend the next 3.5 years. On the bottom is a remnant from his uniform, and I found that after his death in one of the stored boxes, and I really don't know its history, but I have it. And in schools that I go to, it's very moving experience. I pass it, they come up after class, they can touch it, and it really connects them to the very uniform that was worn in these horrible times. The T, the red triangle stands for a political prisoner, and the T is for Czechoslovakia, so everybody's classified. And my father had the status of a political prisoner, but he was a Jew. And it's not, and I don't know the history of this. I don't know how it was that he came to cut it out. I visited Auschwitz this past summer, and I saw photos of prisoners with this exact uniform on. I don't know if it's the same uniform that was worn at Buchenwald, but I originally thought that his status had changed to a yellow star and that this was removed and he cut it out and somehow had it in Buchenwald, but it may have been, there's a story that I'll tell you in a few minutes about his experience at Auschwitz, and maybe it was taken off there. But he was treated as a Jew in terms of the non-Jews did not have to work on Sundays. Jews did. My father had to work. That's the work that he did some of the time, working in a stone quarry, cutting stones. And in fact, his first job was not in the quarry, but carrying these stones from one place to another. And I'd just like to read, at my request when he was 80, he wrote a memoir, and I'd just like to read from that memoir. I was ordered to report to the stone carriers. We had to bring stones from the stone quarry about 2 kilometers outside of the camp to other places in and outside the camp in hand barrows which 2 people had to carry. It was the first terrible experience. Frequently and intermittently, we were ordered to run with the stones in the barrows. Our shoes had wooden soles, and the socks seemed to be made of paper. It was inevitable to get blisters. When they got very bad, we received gauze pads in the infirmary. We had to work regardless of the weather. Worse than the cold was the mud into which the ground frequently turned. A particular torture was the inspection of the shoes by the SS guards. They had to be meticulously clean each morning, and getting them clean each evening after work was an almost impossible task. Just that act of having the belittling, to have to clean your shoes before. There was physical torture and there was mental torture, and that obligation to have clean shoes before the Nazi guard was, I could imagine that as being part of the torture of his experience. But he also, this is one place where luck played an incredible role, because after several months of being in of chopping stones, he got a terrible pain in his neck, so bad, and he had lost weight and he was at his wit's end, but he couldn't go on, and he took the very scary step of going to the infirmary to be seen by the Nazi doctor. It turned out that because these are shovelers, there are many hundreds of them working in the quarry, quite a number. There is something called a shoveler's fracture, a C7 fracture, that the Nazi doctor, because there were so many people with this complaint, was studying. And so my father inadvertently came into the infirmary, and the Nazi doctor wanted to study him, which itself is frightening. But he was put in a special unit, and he was put in a body cast, and he never saw that doctor again. It turned out he was transferred to another camp, and the staff kind of didn't pay attention to these people in the special unit, and he got several weeks of rest. And as a result, he was, and some more nutrition than usual, and as a result, he was able to return and had enough energy to survive. And so that was just one example of the luck he had. Another was being the recipient of an act of kindness. A political prisoner who had been there for years, because this was in operation before the war started for political prisoners, befriended him and brought him once a week half a loaf of bread. And that too was part of the luck he had in surviving. Well, let's carry on. So he was in Buchenwald for 3.5 years. And in spring of 1943, prisoners started being sent from Buchenwald to Auschwitz. And in April, I forgot the exact date, I think 17th or 19th, his name was called, and he was to be sent to Auschwitz. It was just a very few people were sent on any given day, and they were accompanied by an equal number of SS guards. And instead of being a 1.5-day trip on the train, or even just a day trip on the train, it was a 6-day trip. And it was on a commercial train. And every night, it was kind of an opportunity for the SS guards to get a vacation, because every night the prisoners would be brought to the local jail, and the guards would go out on the town and carouse and have fun. And on the last night, when they were close to Auschwitz, the same procedure was followed. And at night, the jailer, who was an anti-Nazi and who lived close enough to Auschwitz to know what happened there, and also to know somewhat the habits of the guards, went to my father's cell, which he shared with another prisoner from Buchenwald. Having looked at their dossier, the records that came with them, that he was worried about which line my father and his cellmate would end up in, and just because of what was in the dossier. And but it was a Friday night, and they were destined to leave and arrive on Saturday. He said, "If I can keep you here another night, you'll arrive on Sunday. And I know that the guards get drunk on Saturday night, and they may not pay any attention to the dossier." And in fact, that's exactly what happened. And I'll let my father tell the next part of this. Oh, well, before that, just something about Auschwitz, which I know you know. It was the largest camp in the whole concentration camp system. 1.1 million people died there, were killed there, were exterminated there. That line, is divided into able-bodied, mainly men, and the other line is children, women, and old people. And you know what happened to the old people. This is a close-up of some of them who were minutes away from their extermination. I can't see that, but oh yeah. So my father arrived on April 25th, and I'll let him tell you about what happened then. He got that tattoo number, which was confirmed by the Holocaust Center in a document that they had access to. And this was the receipt that was sent back to Buchenwald, saying that this bit of merchandise, Paul Heller, was received at Auschwitz. And they kept very careful records of everyone's comings and goings. So let's hear what he had to say about what happened next.
We knew already by the grapevine, we learned in Buchenwald that anybody who arrives in Auschwitz is killed right away or sent into the camp to work. And I said, well, you go to the mining camp in Yakima and set up a hospital there. Wow. And that's what that's what happened, and I was for the next 1.5 years in that camp worked as a doctor and did a lot of good, I thought.
You know, I didn't quiz him very much about what good he did and what horrors he may have had to deal with. But at his memorial service in Chicago, two Polish men in their 60s came up to my sister and I. We didn't know them, and they told us that he had saved their lives at Jaworzno. And so he did some good. And he had an easier life, certainly. It was still difficult. This was another mining place, and in 1943, the Germans were in bad shape. They were starting to see defeats, and they decided to make use of the skills of the prisoners. Hence, this decision to open another camp, another work camp, and to have a clinic there to keep the prisoners healthy enough to mine whatever it was that was there. It's about 30 miles from Auschwitz. It's no longer, there's a plaque there apparently. I visited Auschwitz this past summer. I did not get a chance to go there. There's a housing project over where the camp had been. So he was so it was ironically it was an easier life in Auschwitz than he expected, and but nonetheless hard. But in January of 1945, the war was clearly going very badly for the Germans, and the Russians were coming from the east, and they made the decision to evacuate the camp, all of the camps in the east. And this was, Elie Wiesel described this from the subcamp that he was at. He was at another subcamp of Auschwitz, and he described it in this book, Night, which, if you haven't read it, is very worth reading. My father, from his subcamp, had somewhat of a different experience. They had to march in January January weather, 156 miles. So this was a march from Dachau, which is in the south, in March of 1945, springtime. It's the only photo that the Holocaust Center could provide me with. It was a bit of a different experience for my father, who will tell more of what he experienced here.
Happened to most of the people the same thing what happened to me. We were evacuated when the Germans, when the Russians came close, and we marched for more than 2 weeks to a camp west of Auschwitz in Germany, Groß-Rosen in Silesia. Probably not more than 20% of the people who started arrived in that camp.
My father was quite protective of his emotions, and he would tend to use mathematical terms rather than share the experience of seeing 2,400 people out of 3,000 perish over a 2-week period on the road, freezing to death, just dropping out of exhaustion and being shot, and a horribly gruesome experience that he barely survived. I don't know if I'm not keeping good track of the time. I could, at the end, I can read if there's time. He also, during this walk over 17 days, they would sleep on the road or they would sleep in barns. And in one barn, he found a calendar and a pencil, and he took notes. And later, after liberation, he wrote about each day that he remembered very clearly, because liberation came just 3 months later. And if there's time, I'll share one entry from that diary. So the walk was, as I said, was 156 miles. He got to Gross Rosen, and at Gross Rosen, they spent, I think, a week. It was horrible. He was covered in lice. He was getting sick, but he wasn't. They were going to be shipped elsewhere, and it turned out he was shipped back to Buchenwald, which he was actually happy about, because he left friends. He left people he hoped were still alive, and he knew his way around there, and he was glad to be going back there. But when he got there, what he saw were skeletons of whatever people that he previously knew who were still alive. And he himself had gotten typhus from the lice and that were covering his body, and was very ill. And he was in, I don't know if it's this same infirmary that the Holocaust Center had the photo, they provided that photo, but he was a patient in that barracks until he felt better. And so this was February, March 1945. And April 11th, April 11th, the American Army came. There's Dwight Eisenhower, who was visiting a subcamp of Buchenwald, and so they were liberated on April 11th. And a few days prior to that, the Nazis, fearing that they would be arrested, disappeared. They left the camp, and they took off their uniforms, put on civilian clothing, disappeared, and left the camp to be run by the prisoners. So my father, being a doctor and having just worked as a doctor in Auschwitz, started caring for the other patients in that what was a horse stall. And that building was right at the front of Buchenwald. The first building that you get to when you enter the camp was that building. And, whoops, wrong. And a car pulled up on April 12th, the next day after liberation, and a man got out and turned out to be a reporter, and asked to speak to one of the prisoners. And my father was called out. And now I imagine many of you recognize Edward R. Murrow, graduate of Washington State University, Washington native, grew up in Edison. Anybody not familiar with him? Because when I go to high schools, of course, they don't know the first thing about this man. So so listen carefully to this. This was, he took information and then recorded a broadcast which aired around in England and the United States on April 15th, 1945. And it's hard to hear, just listen carefully.
Permit me to tell you what you will have seen as birds had you been with me on Thursday. It will not
Turn
be
down the
pleasant
volume.
listening.
Turn down the
If
volume.
you are at lunch, or if you have no appetite to hear what Germans have done, now is a good time to switch off the radio. For I propose to tell you of Buchenwald. Men and boys reached out pleasantly. They were in bags, and the remnants of uniform. Death had already marked many of them, but they were smiling with their eyes. I told him soon. Announced to see one of the barrels. It happened to be occupied by Czechoslovakians. When I entered, men crowded around, tried to lift me to their shoulders. They were too weak. Many of them could not get out of bed. I was told that this building had once stabled 80 horses. There were 1,200 men in it. 5 to a bone. The stink was beyond all description. They called the doctor. We inspected it rapidly.
So he mentioned my father's name on the radio. My uncle, who had been successful in getting out in 1938 and was in England, heard the broadcast, and my mother in New York heard the broadcast, and this was the first they knew that he had survived nearly 6 years in the camps. So a couple of days later, Morrow's secretary came back to the camp with a whole stack of telegrams from friends of my father, and this he described as the most joyous day of his life, because he had made it through, and there were people who would help him to have a life going forward. But he was a displaced person. He had no ID. The only ID he had was this. I have it here. A provisional identification card for civilian internees of Buchenwald. It was not a passport. He couldn't leave. And besides that, there were all these terribly sick people who were hanging on by a thread, and the war was over, and there was a chance that they could survive. And because my father was in this first building of the camp, he had access to the U.S. Army personnel and some of the leadership, and he asked, and I think with some others, whether the medical team from the Army could set up a reasonable medical unit. And there was this castle about 15 miles from the camp where they could turn into a little mini hospital. And so my father could not get out anyway, and he spent the next 2 months going back and forth from the camp to this castle, transporting patients, identifying those who had TB, trying to separate them from the others, and caring for them. Ironically, on one of these transports of 15 miles, the car that he was in overturned. He was thrown out of the car, he broke his hip, he was hospitalized, and this is when he wrote up his diary from his notes. But it took incredible, I know I couldn't have made it through all of this, but he just had so much resilience. So also, because he worked so closely with the U.S. Army, they agreed to take him. They were leaving for the U.S. and they were going through Paris, and they agreed to take him to Paris where he could get papers so that he could get out. So he had the good fortune of not having to be in a displaced persons camp, and he went to Paris, was able to go to a Czech embassy, get a Czech passport, and after some time he got a visa to go to England. This was him at that time. He got a visa to go to England, which was good for 6 months, and just at the end of that 6 months, he got this very innocuous-looking stamp, which was his immigration visa to the U.S. So that was his ticket to a future. And in April of 1946, after spending 6 months in England, he boarded a cargo ship, which had about room for 6 passengers, a small boat, and a rocky road across the Atlantic, and made it to New York, where my mom, Lisa Florsheim, was waiting for him. And they had had a very passionate written correspondence during that 6-month period, bearing their souls. I didn't go into details about my mom's very hard times in New York as a refugee and an immigrant, but she had it rough too. They sort of bared their souls to each other. It was pretty clear that they were going to be an item and that's they were, and they got married. My father, it was very difficult to get residency positions. My father just had a MD degree, but he was able to put together a couple of years of training, very hodgepodge. 1 year in a TB hospital as a resident, followed by a rotating internship at another hospital, and it's a whole other story about my mom's time in New York, but that I won't share. So they got married. My father left his training programs because he was making $50 a month, and now a baby was on the way, and that was me, and he had a new life. He was probably the first displaced person to get U.S. citizenship. It made it into the Washington Star and the New York Times. And from there, I won't go into detail, but he had a very productive life. Despite having just 2 years of actual training, he became an internationally known research hematologist, made some very crucial set the stage for what just recently was authorized as a treatment for sickle cell anemia. And that was my mom and my father and his brother, who was a professor at Northwestern. And I had my father was, before his research, was given the highest research award within the VA system, and I was able to attend that ceremony in Washington, D.C. This was him in his later life. He and his brother returned to Europe. My father loved mountain climbing, and then on the right, after my mother died, my father remarried a woman who had escaped from a concentration camp outside of Krakow and had survived the war with false papers. And just a little about myself. I followed in my father and grandfather's footsteps. I became a doctor. I had a calling, I think, for working with marginalized people. I worked at the Pike Market Clinic for many years. I developed somewhat of an expertise in HIV, and I was able to have a global career between 2004 and 2018 working for the CDC in Cambodia, Ethiopia, and South Africa. And I have my own family, and whenever I look at them, I know that we won. But that is not to say that just seeing what people are capable of, we are capable of this horror. We other populations, and then it's easy to hate them. And we're seeing that playing out now in Israel and Palestine and the Gaza Strip, where the people who attacked and killed in the most heinous ways 1,400 people on October 7th. Yeah, October 7th. It's already more than a month. And the wanton destruction of Gaza by the Israeli government, it's just, one can do horrible things when one objectifies, when one allows oneself to hate. My father was victim to it, and so many thousands of people are victim to it today, both in our country and around the world. So we have to fight it, and there is resilience but we have to rely on more than luck to keep things like this from happening again. So thank you very much. Is there time, are there time for comments and questions? Good. It sometimes takes a while for people to gather their thoughts, but does anybody want to make a comment? I would be glad to read one, as I said before, an excerpt from that walk. And then, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay,
Go
well,
ahead.
We apparently were not supposed to use the cowshed. It is 4 a.m., and after about 3 hours of fitful rest, we are being chased out and must wait outside. The SS guards curse. They also have to be outside. There is continuous noise coming from the barn, a mixture of yelling and moaning. We cannot make out any words, but it must prevent anybody from sleeping. It is still dark when the SS guards open the barn and chase the prisoners out. It takes about an hour to form our convoy for the march. Many stay behind in the barn. The same old morning ceremonial. This is 9 days into their 17-day walk. The same old morning ceremonial. Some have been trampled to death, others are unconscious or are too weak to go on and stay where they are out of despair, waiting to be killed. It is certain that the SS will fulfill their wish. I cannot find 2 of my best friends. Somebody tells me that they were hurt during the night and have to stay behind. I ponder for a moment whether I should not try to find them. This would mean sharing their fate. I decide against it, although I begin to doubt that survival is possible. This doubt is hardened by the events of the day. We march, if this slow forward moving still can be called marching, all day, about 20 kilometers to a small village near Reichenbach. I am amazed that until now I have kept up my strength. My shoes, gloves, and earmuffs are so severely torn that they offer hardly any protection, and the stress of walking, the exposure to cold, and the hunger is driving me to despair. How lucky I was that I was with the cart commando for several days. The food, mainly sugar, which we stole from the cart, has given me some energy reserves, but this little buildup begins to dissipate. I begin to wish I had joined my friends this morning. Is there a goal to our march? Is it a camp? Or is the SS determined to march us until all have ended in the ditch next to the road with bullets in their bodies? Today we heard SS men say that we will be on foot until we get to Gross Rosen. From there we are supposed to be transported by train to a camp in the center of Germany, Sachsenhausen, Dachau, Buchenwald. But Gross Rosen is about 150 kilometers away, or 7 to 10 days of marching. We cannot survive another week unless a miracle happens. But hasn't the miracle happened already? I'm sorry. Aren't about half of the people from Dworzno and Blechhammer still alive? Yes, but the rate of dying has increased because everybody's reserves have dwindled. It looks hopeless. Nobody thinks of escaping any longer unless he wants to commit suicide. But death seems to be certain anyway. These are the thoughts which tumble about in one's mind almost continuously. I play with thoughts about the best way of dying. It might even be beautiful to lie down tonight in the straw and to give up and to dream and arrive dreaming in the other world. These daydreams during the march bring up primitive religious images. The other world becomes visible, with lots of well-dressed people walking about. I am called before a judge and asked about the pluses and minuses of my life. I don't know. I am sure only of not really having lived. I was thrown like Joseph into the pit, but Joseph rose from it to a dignified and productive life, full of useful activity. Joseph was tested. Is this perhaps the meaning of our suffering? I feel as if I have to ask the judge to be returned to earth, to wait for real life. I do it, and the wish is granted. This daydream makes me determined to live. but this determination weakens again at night in the cold barn, when the cold makes it difficult to sleep, when the stomach is all cramped from hunger, when the fingers and toes are painful and numb at the same time. But then again, the despair yields to the feeling of being preserved for something, of being tested by fate. It would be cowardly to give up. Giving up is irreversible. No, this cannot be. Freedom is perhaps closer than you believe. Do you know what freedom is? The 6 years of concentration camp have made you lose the feeling of freedom. Yes, remember, there is joy, work of your choice, love, home, people without uniforms, books, music, helping others, and many other things that make sense in a purposeful life. I am grateful for these encouragements from the depth of my soul. How wonderful that this depth exists and that it has not been covered up by the strenuous attempts of adjusting to the experiences of the past 6 years. I even begin to remember passages from Goethe's Faust, and I keep reciting to myself, I feel my powers loftier, clearer, I glow as drunk with new-made wine, my heart has strength to face the world again.
Thank you for that. Just a couple of comments. One, I had the opportunity to go through Dachau on a freezing day going through there, and I don't know how people survived. A good friend of mine who spoke to another Rotary club about 8 years ago was a survivor. He was about 5 years old at that time. He was from Poland. The Russians came and took him into Siberia. They were on a boxcar, and it's freezing weather. In order to keep warm, they all got in a circle, person in the middle, and they get just the body weight. And I hate to say this, but when anyone died, they just kicked him off the train. And his sister, his little baby sister, died and kicked her. It was just horrible. And but anyway, I get choked up because he's a really good friend of mine. But I just thank you for standing up and telling the story. We can never forget this.
Thank you. Yeah.
Do you remember the age at which you really understood what your father was telling you?
My father never told me anything when I was a kid. When I was 11, I was snooping around in our basement, in a closet in our basement, and I found something. In 1948, the wife of the director of Buchenwald was applying for American citizenship, and there was evidence, or at least rumors, that she had committed war crimes. And so there was a Senate investigation of whether that was the case, and if it was the case, they would deny her citizenship. And I was born in Washington, D.C., and they were able to find my father. My father gave testimony affirming that she indeed committed war crimes that he himself suffered. And I found the congressional record in a box in the closet in our basement. I devoured it. I read it, and I put it back. I knew I wasn't supposed to see it. I came back repeatedly to reread it, and I didn't tell anyone. I knew I've known since, I can't remember not knowing the words Buchenwald and Auschwitz, but my father, as a sort of ambitious scientist, would, after dinner, go upstairs to his study and not play with us, not spend time with us. And my mom would always sort of apologize for him, saying he lost 6 years of his life. He's trying to catch up. And so that, I don't know when I truly learned those words, but I can't remember not knowing them. And that those details. That was a darkness I was not supposed to shed light on, and I did, and I've known it since I was 11. But he didn't share, he translated that diary when I was already a doctor. I was late 20s, and he gave it to my sister and I as a sort of offering to share that part of his experience. And then when he was 80, I asked him to write a memoir, and he expanded on that. He didn't talk freely about it. I do regret, I have, the whole of that Shoah interview, but I do regret in the not knowing some of the, there are a lot of questions I would have liked to have asked him that I never got a chance to. There were other hands? But that's a good question, because it's very typical amongst children of survivors that in the family, when they were kids, not discussed. And my parents, my father had a significant accent. We grew up in a suburb of Chicago that looked like a European town, but it was it was anti-Semitic, and there was only one other Jew in my high school. And my parents were interested in our assimilating, so I did not grow up with a Jewish education. We went to a Unitarian church, which was more in keeping. He wasn't religious to start with, and then the camp experience, while it turned many into hanging on more deeply to their religion, in my father's case, it had the opposite effect. And they were interested in our assimilating. So I didn't learn German, I didn't learn Judaism until much later in my life, etc. Well, thank you all very much, and I'll hang around for a while, and if anyone wants to have a conversation, I'm here.
Thank you very much. I'm speechless because that story is so powerful, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate you bringing light and sharing that story, because we talked about when we were sitting at the table how important it is for people to be aware of the horrible situations, not just during the Holocaust, but even now, like we talked about, and how important it is to honor the people who lost their lives, to honor the people who did survive by knowing and by educating not only ourselves, but people around us. So important. And we as Rotarians, we're not about hate, we're about love. And it's important for us to spread that. We don't use the word love enough. And it's up to us to make sure that we do that. And I am just so grateful for your visit today. Thank you. Just one last thing. We do have a World Community Service Committee meeting with Dwayne Monick directly following. And Dr. Heller did say he would stay and meet some people. I know a lot of people want to meet you. And again, thank you. Our meeting is adjourned.